joining us right now to get more into the NBA and, of course, the Sixers, who seemingly can't stay out of the news themselves. It's like a Philly tradition, like unlike any other. Sixers and Eagles can't stop talking about them. Bryan Toporek joins us again here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. Bryan, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing all right. And, like clockwork, as soon as you stop talking about the Sixers, they suddenly pop back up. And it's not just because we were writing articles about them, all of us. It's because of the fact that apparently, if you believe all the rumors out there, it seems like every NBA team is calling, quote-unquote, the Sixers about Ben Simmons at this point, which last time I checked, I thought all these Sixers fans were like, nobody wants Ben Simmons. And you come to find out that, oh, wait a minute, a 3-time All-Star, a 2-time first-team All-NBA defensive team, a third All-NBA team, 1-time third-team All-NBA. People are interested in that because, let me check, he might be a better fit somewhere else than he is here potentially.
Yeah, I mean, this is the time of the offseason that every team should be doing their due diligence. So if any star is potentially on the trade market, you should at least call and see what the Sixers would want in return. So, yeah, I'm not surprised. I think, you see what happens in the Atlanta series, and emotionally you're just, this guy's a bum, he's got to go. And then cooler heads prevail in the coming weeks, and you're like, okay, this guy might not be equipped to help the Sixers win a title as currently constructed based on his, current skill set. But that doesn't mean he couldn't help another team or, who's to say he's not going to improve this offseason. He's only 24, with this guy was being talked about like he was John Wall and, just like a complete, you'll have to give up multiple picks just to get off of him. That was never the case. Are they going to get, could they do Ben Simmons for Damian Lillard straight up? No, I don't think the Blazers are going to do that. But, can he be involved in a big package that helps the Sixers retool their team around Joel Embiid? Yeah, I think that's still very possible.
And the big key, Bryan, is at the end of the day, who the guy in charge is. It's not Sam Hinkie. No offense to Sam, but he did make his mistakes along the way. Okay, he's not Colangelo, who is a complete imbecile. This is not as you've called it, the Sixers cabal with Brett Brown and the Shadow Council. All right, and it's not Elton Brand in his first time ever in an executive position. No, this is the man who makes some of the craziest trades in NBA history work, Daryl Morey. So if anybody can make a Ben Simmons trade work to the benefit of the Sixers in a way that maybe no one can foresee, and maybe it is the Warriors or the Timberwolves or the Pelicans or whoever else, it would be Morey.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason you bring an executive like Daryl Morey in. You want to have the confidence that the person running your team, if you do have a situation like this where you end up having to break up the Embiid-Simmons core, if that's the path he decides, I'm confident. Like, this is the first time in 5 years that I felt confident in the Sixers front office heading into the offseason. That I know they're going to make the right moves. I mean, I think he made more good moves than bad last year, turning Al Horford and Josh Richardson into Danny Green and Seth Curry, getting Maxey at 21. You kind of whiffed on George Hill at the trade deadline, but you could at least understand the reasoning behind it. And even still, George Hill is now a $10 million contract that they can dangle for salary matching this offseason. So, I think Morey, I'm sure, has been making his calls. Adrian Wojnarowski reported last week that he met with Ben Simmons' agent at the Combine to at least discuss, Ben didn't request a trade, and he's under contract for 4 more years. So even if he did, good luck. The Sixers don't have to trade him this offseason. But, I'm sure those conversations are ongoing. And Morey, I have no doubt, is racking up a ridiculous phone bill right now, probing the league, trying to see. Again, he's got to do the same thing that every other team does. Call 29 other teams and say, if we were to shop Ben Simmons, what would you be willing to offer? And no team is going to give their best offer right away. But if you can at least, find a starting point and then try to bridge the gap from there, I'm sure he's going to be trying to do that over the coming weeks.
And part of that reason he has to do it is because, shameless plug, I just wrote about this today at 973ESPN.com. One of the lessons I think the Sixers can learn from the 4 remaining teams in the playoffs is the fact that none of those guys are doing it by themselves. Remember that one game where it was just Seth Curry and Joel Embiid were the only guys who scored in the second half? That's embarrassing. You know what? The Clippers are now 3-3 without Kawhi. And the margin they've lost by in those 3 losses is combined 11 points. I don't think that's an accident, Brian. Look at the other teams. Chris Middleton has come up huge. All right. Devin Booker, and outside from him and Chris Paul, there's 3-4 other guys all scoring double digits. Trae Young has a good supporting cast around him. I think it's pretty obvious to anybody who has 2 eyes, who probably knows more basketball than I do, if I can figure it out, they can, that Joel Embiid just needs more around him.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of the focus this offseason will understandably be on Ben and whether they trade him and what they get back for him. But that's not the only decision they have to make. If they keep the number 28 pick, can they get an impact contributor with that pick? Do they shop that pick maybe to bring in someone using their trade exception? Who can they sign with their taxpayer mid-level exception, most of which they didn't use last season? I think what we saw in the playoffs, the way I've been framing it, is kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. It wasn't one single mistake that undid them, but they've made a ton of mistakes over really the last 5 years. And we saw it just deplete in terms of surrounding talent. Like, I love Mike Scott as a person, and I love what he represented, but giving him the room mid-level exception for 2 years and then having him be unplayable in the playoffs this year, that takes away one rotation piece. I think, I asked Daryl during his presser last week, is there anything that you can take away from the 4 conference finalists? And he said, that's a good question, but it's still early. We're going to go over that in the coming weeks. One thing that I've noticed is that 3 of the 4 have guys who they hit on minimum signings. So Cameron Payne for Phoenix, Reggie Jackson for the Clippers, Bryn Forbes, Bobby Portis, both on cheap deals for Milwaukee. So, can they find that rotation piece in free agency this offseason, whether it's the taxpayer mid-level, whether it's on a minimum deal? If they can do that, we've seen the value of those types of players really throughout the playoffs.
Bryan Toporek joining us here on Game Night on 97.3 at Beat Toporek on Twitter. The podcast is the NBA podcast. Also, he is a NBA writer for Forbes Sports. Now, Brian, just to move it, not 100% away from the Sixers, but obviously a name that's also being rumored out there because of multiple reports this weekend is Damian Lillard. And this kind of ties in something you and I started talking about off air. I want to bring it on air, which is, this is my working theory. I think Damian Lillard is unhappy with Portland, not because they hired Chauncey Billups, because we remotely reported that he wanted Billups. He was one of the 2 guys that he wanted. But I think it's because Portland ran him through the shredder in a way that Dallas didn't run Jason Kidd through the shredder. And it seems like Lillard is saying, depending on all the reports out there, if you want to combine them all together, some sort of way, it's like, you guys run a really weird organization. I just want to win basketball games. And you guys are worried about the strangest things that are not of consequence to what's important to me. So unless you want to win basketball games, I'm on board. If that's not what you're interested in, I want out of here. That's my interpretation of things.
Yeah, I can't tell who's having a worse offseason between Dallas and Portland, because I'm good thinking back like a couple weeks ago when their general manager, Neil O'Shea, holds an end-of-season press conference, and he just threw Terry Stotts, their now former head coach, completely under the bus and saying, the roster wasn't the problem. It was the coaching staff, even though they were 29th in defensive efficiency this year. And it came off as a guy just passing the buck. And I'm sure Dame took note of that. And then, this is the risk you run when you start speaking, giving your preferences about big things like this, free agency, coaching, whatever, to the media. He spoke with Chris Haynes a lot of Yahoo Sports and said, these are the guys who I would like to see. He said Jason Kidd and Billups. Jason Kidd's history is well known at this point. I don't think, I believe Dame when he says he doesn't know, this rape accusation against Billups from 1997. I believe that he didn't know about that because a lot of people didn't know about it really until the last couple of weeks. As Billups' name came up in coaching, as a potential target for some of these teams, it started becoming more and more prevalent, especially on basketball Twitter. So I think now you lose the plausible deniability. But yeah, I think he's using the coaching search and this decision to hire Chauncey like, I don't think if they backtracked and hired Becky Hammon instead, Dame's like, okay, I feel great. We're going to stay in Portland forever. I think he's 31 years old. He's frustrated how they've flamed out and kind of how they've fallen from their run to the Western Conference Finals a couple of years ago. And he's probably looking around the landscape and saying, like, realistically, I don't see a move, even if we trade CJ McCollum for Ben Simmons or something like that. Is that going to put us on the same tier as Phoenix and the Clippers and the Lakers and Milwaukee and Brooklyn? I don't think so. So, he's said he's loyal and he wants to retire in Portland, and I believe there's part of him that does. But at the same time, I think when you're 31, you probably say, like, all right, the clock of my career in my prime is ticking. And if there's no window for us to get back to championship contention, maybe I do start looking elsewhere.
Yeah, and also the fact that if you look at the roster just as an objective individual, you say when you're depending on Carmelo Anthony and Norman Powell to be big contributors at this point in both of their careers, I think you might have something to worry about, because Damian's going out there and giving his blood, sweat, and tears. And the big move they made at the trade deadline was trading Gary Trent for Norman Powell, which wasn't exactly an upgrade. It was kind of like a marginal move. And if you're Damian Lillard, you're thinking, at least I would if I was him, I'd be like, are you guys seeing what I'm seeing? Like, do you understand what's going on? And as you said, when you throw the coach under the bus, there's a part of the player that's like, wow, I didn't expect that coming out of here, especially the fact that Stockton was there for a decade.
Right, exactly. I mean, like, you have to take it's what we're saying with Ben Simmons and Doc Rivers throughout Philly this last week. It's like, if you fall short of a championship, you need to take that opportunity for self-reflection and see what you did wrong. So for Neil O'Shea in Portland, signing Derrick Jones Jr., I think that for the full non-taxpayer mid-level, when Derrick Jones Jr. fell out of the rotation, wasn't playing really at all in the playoffs, that's a mistake. Own up to it. Like, having accountability starts at the top of an organization. But if you're going out there having a press conference saying, oh no, this wasn't my fault, it was everyone else's fault, the players and the coaches, they suck, but I'm great. Like, of course you're going to be mad if you're a player.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned head coaching hires. Bryan Toporek joining us here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. So we have Ime Udoka up in Boston. Love it. I'm all on board with it. I especially love it because we know that Tatum and Brown went to Brad Stevens and says, this is the guy we want. And Brad was willing to bring in somebody who his players wanted. That's a good sign in Boston. Rick Carlisle to Indiana, though, I don't fully understand that one. I feel like, wasn't he already in Indiana like 15 years ago? So it's like that whole situation just feels weird to me. Billups, I love Billups going to Portland. I love seeing them taking a guy that Billups has made it very vocal that he wanted to be back in the NBA coaching. And he's putting in the work. He's putting in the effort. But the Jason Kidd in Dallas hire is interesting because this feels like almost a Godfather moment where it's like you're part of the family, you're coming home, we're gonna have you kiss the ring. Dirk wants you to come home. You're gonna hire JJ Barea to be part of your coaching staff. Luka's okay with it because you played in Dallas twice. Like, the whole thing just comes off as so bizarre because if Jason Kidd would be hired anywhere else, it would have been like, all right, Jason Kidd didn't go well in his first two stops, okay, whatever. But the way Dallas handled the whole thing just comes off as so like this is the Godfather and this is some sort of slime going on here, Brian.
Yeah, I think it's telling that every time Jason Kidd's name popped up in coaching rumors for any team, there was always an article like, please God, no, not Jason Kidd. Do not hire this guy. And I know, like, Mavs Moneyball, I think the day that he got hired, ran an article that morning saying, please do not hire Jason Kidd. This guy is not the right coach for us. So, I mean, like Chauncey, there's on-court and off-court that you have to focus on. Mm-hmm. Off-court, Kidd was arrested for, domestic violence in 2001. He had a DUI in 2012 as well. So, like, if we're talking about, overall culture, you have to focus on that, especially for the Mavericks, who are still dealing with the fallout of a sexual harassment scandal a couple of years ago. It just sends a very bad signal to a giant portion of your fan base, like all of your female fans, that we don't really seem to be taking this issue seriously at all. But that was also on the court, as you said, he wasn't a great coach in his first 2 stints in Brooklyn and Milwaukee either. It's like Milwaukee instantly became a title contender as soon as he left. And that's not a great sign for Dallas. I think, from Dallas's perspective, you figure Luka Doncic is our best player. We're bringing in a Hall of Fame point guard to help usher him to this next level, even though he's already almost at an MVP caliber already. And yeah, the familiarity, I think, is his other big selling point. Like he's, as you said, he's willing to kiss the ring for Mark Cuban in particular, and Dirk signed off on it. That's great. It just feels like there had to be a better choice. And, given there's reported tension, Tim Cato of The Athletic has been all over this giant disaster offseason for Dallas, dating back to Donnie Nelson's departure. But Jamal Mosley, who is a well-respected assistant there, Luka really liked him. He's going to leave now, it sounds like. So it's a lot of turnover at a not great time to have that turnover because Luka's eligible for an extension this year. I think he's going to take it. Like, I don't think any of these moves preclude him from taking the extension and wanting to stay in Dallas for the next couple seasons. But, in the back of your mind, the clock is already starting to tick in terms of if this goes south in a couple of years, then Luka is going to be in that extension already. He's going to have, 2 or 3 years left on the deal. And that's when we start to hear the rumblings, much like we are with Dame right now. Maybe he's not long for Dallas.
Bryan, before we get to the teams on the court, we do have a comment in the stream that is exactly the comment I knew was going to come. So I do want to address it if you give me a hot second, because Kyle, who watches a lot of the shows, he watches a lot of comment stuff, but he says, it's trash for us bringing it up that Jason Kidd's passed. And I want to explain to Kyle, the reason why we're bringing it up is because the Portland just ran Chauncey Billups through the shredder for his off-the-court issues. Dallas didn't run Jason Kidd through the same shredder. Okay, it almost felt like a fait accompli that they were hiring Jason Kidd and hiring Nico Harrison as their new GM, the guy from Nike. Literally, we kept hearing about, Portland is re-interviewing Mike D'Antoni, who's never won a championship at any level, basically, except for some random league out in the middle of nowhere, for a job that the player Lillard wants a guy for. So we're explaining that on one hand, Portland is treating the coach situation one way and Dallas treating a situation completely different. So there's double standards. That's why it's got to be brought up, Kyle. It's being brought up because we live in a world where people don't want to report both sides of the story. They only want to report on the side of the story that suits them.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, I saw Kendrick Perkins of ESPN went on air earlier today and said, he kind of defended both guys. And, it's a tricky conversation because, when, you can't say that these guys don't necessarily, we're not saying they don't ever deserve to work again, but, where is the line in terms of do they deserve a second chance as an NBA head coach when there's only 30 of these positions to go around and far more qualified candidates than there are spots? Should there be a higher standard, even if, back in Billups' playing days, this didn't come up, or back in Kidd's playing days, or back in his early coaching days, these things weren't as much of an issue. We can have this day of reckoning better later than never.
Yeah, and at some point, it's listen, if we're going to move on, we're going to move on, right? But, I just don't like the fact that they, Chauncey, they treat him one way, Jason gets treated another way. That's my biggest problem. I don't like double standards. I have a big problem with double standards, but that's just me, Bryan.
That's fair. Yeah, it's a tricky situation to navigate here, and I'm glad that these conversations are at least coming up. I think it would have been really gross if, for both Portland and Dallas, if they tried to sweep this under the rug and no one would talk about it. I know Portland is having a presser tomorrow to officially introduce Chauncey, and I'm sure they're going to have questions asked about the situation, and I'm really curious to hear what they have to say.
All right, Bryan Toporek joining us here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. Let's get to the court tonight. Game 5, Suns, Clippers. We saw 90s basketball on Saturday night. Basically, nobody could make a shot for half the quarter in the fourth quarter, but it was a slug-out fight. And listen, I don't know if the Clippers are going to win this game tonight, Bryan, but I think it's a huge hat tip to that organization to say, we were competitive despite the fact that our best player isn't on the floor. I want the Suns in the NBA Finals. I think this could be the year Chris Paul finally won the championship. But I'm not going to be mad if the Clippers win tonight because the Suns can still win it in Game 6. And, Brian, let's be realistic. This Clippers team, Paul George, Reggie Jackson, Ty Lue, they've shown us a lot in these playoffs.
Yeah, they definitely have. I think, you can look back to last summer when the Sixers were potentially pursuing Ty Lue, and then Doc Rivers becomes available and they go for him instead. But you have to wonder, seeing the adjustments that Ty Lue has made throughout the playoffs, how the Sixers would have fared with Ty Lue instead of Doc. That said, I mean, look, the Clippers, they had just have no business being here right now. As soon as Kawhi went down in that Utah series, they're tied 2-2, going to Utah for Game 5. My podcast co-host and I wrote them off completely. We said, this thing is over. Probably over in 6. We just, we buried them. And Paul George, for as much crap as he caught last year, the pandemic P nickname, no Paul George slander this offseason. He's been fantastic. The Clippers organization's just done an amazing job. And I think it's a testament to all of them for just never backing down despite all of the mounting issues they faced. No, I think what we're seeing now, they just have dead legs. I think they played every other day for the past month. They didn't have a big break because they keep going to having these series extended as long, 7 in the first round and then 6 in the second round, and their series starts 2 days later. So, they're just exhausted, and down your best player, what do you expect from them? Like they're going to lose this series, but I don't think they should be looking at this as a failure of a playoff run. And I don't think Kawhi heading into free agency is looking at this Clippers roster and thinking, oh no, I gotta leave. I gotta get out of here. There's no chance.
Then on the Eastern Conference side, we have the Hawks and the Bucks. Obviously, Trae Young, you don't like to see him sprain his ankle. They're saying it's a bone bruise. All right, but we know those things are pain threshold situations. And Trae said he was having trouble doing what he usually does. So is it time to just check the Hawks off as they're cooked?
I think, yeah. I think most likely, maybe Trae surprises us and steals one more game. But going into this series, I thought it was the Bucks to lose as long as they just didn't play stupid. And they played pretty dumb in Game 1. But now they've really seemed to find their rhythm. Game 2, they just annihilated the Hawks. In Game 3, they made some smart adjustments as well. Chris Middleton has been fantastic in Game 3 in particular. Drew Holiday struggled last night, but was good earlier in the series. I just think the Bucks have too much firepower for this Hawks team. And, frankly, the Hawks are playing with house money at this point. Like, they should not have beaten the Sixers, and they did, but the Bucks are a better team than the Sixers were, and the Bucks are playing with far more confidence than the Sixers did. So, yeah, I think there's a real chance this thing is over in 5, and I'm ready to pencil in a Bucks-Suns finals. My brain has already moved on to that.
I agree with you there. You can check out more about the NBA coaching hires, the conference finals teams on the NBA podcast. Bryan Toporek is the co-host. He also writes for the NBA about it on Forbes Sports. As all guests, he joined us here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN on the video stream. Bryan, always good to see you. I always appreciate you jumping on. Enjoy the game tonight.
Thank you, Josh. Always happy to come on.